Hi, I'm Cautex, and about a month and a half ago, I released a video where I discussed ideas for tools that I believe would cause a paradigm shift in the way that people do theory crafting. One of the ideas was to be able to take combat logs and then to rip out boss positioning data so that we could more accurately simulate what combat actually looks like and no longer be limited to light movement, heavy movement, and so on type presets. Because YouTube decided that it didn't want to share my video all that much, I decided that rather than waiting for somebody else to build the tool, I'd try to make it myself. In this video, I'm going to be going over my progress on making that tool and what still needs to be done before I feel like it's going to be ready to share with the public. I'll be doing my best to minimize explaining things with technical mumbo jumbo as much as possible, and whenever that is necessary, I'll also be doing my best to give a non technical explanation alongside it so that you don't need to have any sort of technical knowledge to understand what it is that I'm talking about. To start off, I want to give a brief demonstration of the tool in its current state. Okay, so I have all of the source code that I built in Python. I'm not really going to be going into a lot of detail on this, but I'll explain basically how it works as we go. Now, when I run this, it's going to create a little UI that I can then use, and it says, and in here I can put a Warcraft logs URL. So, for example, I have this one from a heroic pug that I did a couple weeks ago, and I can paste that in there, and then it's going to grab all of the kills of all the fights that I can then select from. So, for example, we did one pull on Stone Legion Generals, but it wasn't a kill, so it doesn't show up in that list. Now, just to show that it doesn't only work with this one, let's do a different heroic pug that I did, I believe 2 weeks ago. It doesn't really matter, but we're going to do that, and we're going to grab that log, and this time we only went up to Zymox, and we killed that. Okay, great. Now, if I select, for example, Zymox, and I hit generate the movement script, it takes a little bit because my code is really, really inefficient, but when it's done, it's going to spit out the movement script that I can then take and put into Simcraft as an override, and it will then simulate that sort of movement for the fight. So if I copy that and I open up in Simcraft, so we're back into Simcraft, right? And then I can import from the Simcraft add-on, and I got that, right? If I hit, well, we've already done, if I just hit import, and then we can hit simulate, and it says we're doing 5270 DPS, but that's on a patchwork style fight. Yep, fight style is patchwork. Now, if I go to overrides and I paste that movement script in there, it will simulate it using that movement. So if we simulate it, it says, hey, we had all these raid events in here. Okay. And also you did a bit less DPS because, well, which makes sense because you have to move a bit more. Now, I've been building this tool in a programming language called Python, and I selected this language because it's the only language that I have any sort of experience with, though that experience is extremely limited. As an example of how little programming experience I actually have, this program was the first time that I've ever interacted with an API, which for non-technical viewers basically means I had never made a program that talks to other programs before, and that's something that's really, really common. So basically, I have no idea what I'm doing, and I've been figuring it out as I go. So here's basically how this tool works. Once you've got a log that you've selected and then you pick a boss and click run, the program sends that information to Warcraft logs and says, give me every log entry where the boss took damage. The reason for this is that every single one of those log entries contains the boss's position. Also, these log entries are generally happening multiple times a second, so it gives a really accurate account of exactly where the boss is and when. However, when it sends me these log entries, there's a lot of information that it sends back that I don't really care about. So after it gives me all these entries, I do a bunch of stuff to convert what Warcraft log sends me into a series of timestamps and X and Y coordinates. From there, I take all these timestamps and then I group them into quarter-second intervals. Then I do a bit of math to figure out how much distance was traveled over the course of that interval. Then all that information gets sent to what I think is basically the heart of this tool, which is the process that groups these timestamps into discrete movements. The purpose of this is so that the end movement script that you're going to be putting into Simcraft isn't just 1,000 lines of tiny little movements. Detecting the start of a movement is pretty easy, but figuring out when you want to end a movement is a bit trickier. So how I do that is I say that if the boss hasn't moved for 2 seconds, then the movement's over. So for example, if a boss moves 5 yards, then it stops for half a second, then it moves another 10 yards, that would be considered a single 15-yard movement. The second thing that I do to clean things up is that if the total distance traveled during the course of a move is under 3 yards, then I just ignore it and it doesn't count as a move. The reason for this is that bosses like to make tiny little micro movements in their positioning, and those movements don't really have any meaningful effect on your DPS because you're still going to be in melee range, so I just ignore them. Eventually, in a public version of the tool, I would likely make it so that you can adjust these thresholds yourself, but that's something way off in the future. Once this part of the program is done, it spits out a list of whenever the movement started, the distance traveled over the course of that movement, and when the movement ended. Then, after that, it's just a matter of slapping those numbers into the format that Simcraft likes for the movement overrides. It took a lot of trial and error to get it so that the end of movement script lines up with what the boss actually does when you watch it on the Warcraft Logs replay. There's likely many optimizations that can be made, but for now, I'm just happy that it works, and it works consistently for all but a couple fights, and I'm going to talk about those couple fights in a little bit. Now, there are a lot of things that still need to be done on my end to make this tool meaningfully useful, but all of that is to some extent superseded by the fact that currently we cannot input custom movement scripts into Top Gear on Raid Boss. So even if I had everything working perfectly, until that's an option, the value of this tool is limited by the fact that you're more or less stuck using actual Simcraft, which is nowhere near as nice as using Simcraft via raid bots. Now let's talk about things that I need to do before this tool is going to be ready for the public. In Castle Nathria, there is literally only one fight that is a single target fight, and it also doesn't do goofy things that would require being accounted for in a simulation that is anywhere near accurate. And that fight is Artificer Zymox. Every single other fight, there is something that should be accounted for in the modeling beyond simply the boss's movement in the simulations. So, for example, Shriekmane goes immune for a while partway through the fight. On Huntsman, there's the dogs, and then also the Barghast ads. On Hungering Destroyer, my method of tracking the boss's position doesn't really work because the player is the one that needs to run out for Consume. Lady Enerva has ads. Sludgefist has a damage amp when he charges a pillar, plus you also have to run out for the stomps. Stone Leech in general is 2 bosses, but it's 1 at a time, plus ads during an immunity phase, and then finally both bosses together at the end. All of these issues actually have pretty straightforward solutions because Simcraft already has functionality for dealing with these things like ad spawns, immunities, and damage amps. This means that really the tricky part is just detecting when they're happening, and I'm currently working on building out the methods of identifying exactly when ads spawn and die, as well as when and for how long bosses are immune or take increased damage. Now there are 3 fights that I didn't mention: Sun King, Council, and Denathrius. Figuring out how to accurately simulate these fights is not nearly as straightforward as the other ones. Sun King is an absolute mess from the perspective of trying to model it in Simcraft because the boss doesn't show up until partway through the fight, and there's also about a billion ads that would need to be tracked. Council has many of the same problems, but expressed slightly differently. You've got 3 bosses that die progressively over the course of the fight. You've got attendants, which cause periods of immunity. Then there's obviously the waiters and the stone guards. And then there's the dance phases, which then creates a short duration haste buff that you would have to create. I'm currently unsure about the best way to go about generating a simulation of the Sun King and Council encounters that's meaningfully more actionable than the currently available presets, and as such, they are pretty low on my list of priorities to work on. Lastly, Sire Denathrius would be a rather straightforward fight to simulate if it wasn't for one thing: the mirrors. When Denathrius goes through a mirror and teleports to the other side of the room, if you put that movement into Simcraft, it would simulate your character literally running over to the other side of the room, rather than teleporting with the mirror because, well, it simply doesn't know that that's a thing. Now, there are a few ideas that I have for how to deal with this, which I plan to work on after I get done with the initial bulk of fight-specific variances, because a lot of the tools that I'm going to be building in order to create those variances, such as dealing with ad spawns, will be necessary for dealing with simulating Denathrius properly. While I'm building these fight-specific considerations, I'm also trying to do it in a way that ensures that it'll be accurate regardless of the difficulty of the fight seen in the logs. I'm also trying to build these tools in such a way that when the next raid comes out in 9.1, hopefully I'll be able to easily identify and apply the necessary variances to fights so that I can generate accurate override scripts and publish them as quickly as possible, even in the scenario where I don't have the tool released to the public yet. The last thing that I need to figure out is how exactly to make this tool something that can be actually shared with and then used by the public. Currently, the biggest issues that I'm going to have with releasing this tool to the public is the way that my program uses the API. So I'm going to try to explain my concerns with as little technical mumbo jumbo as possible. So when my program talks to Warcraft Logs and asks it to give me information, it has a token that it shares alongside that request that basically says, "Hi, I'm me, and I'm cool, so you can talk to me because I'm cool." And then it tells Warcraft Logs what information it wants to be sent back. Warcraft Logs checks that token and says, "Yep, you are you, and you are indeed cool, so I'll talk to you," and then it gives you the information that you requested. Now, when it does this, it also tracks how much information you're asking for, and it will limit how much it's going to share with you. And this is an hourly limit, so it's going to share up to a certain amount of information every hour. The reason for these limits is an attempt to try and prevent people from being dicks and intentionally tying up resources of the website. Now, I have two primary concerns with the implications of interacting with this system if and when I release it to the public, based off of how things are built right now. The first issue that I see is that the program is using my API access token, which again is that token that just says, hey, I'm me and you can talk to me, and that's hard coded into the program, which means that if somebody were to take the program and decompile it, which means take the executable and take it back to its source code, then they would have the token and they could pretend to be me and do malicious things potentially with that token. The other problem with having it hard-coded in this way is that these tokens are only good for 1 month. So I would need to be progressively updating the program and sending it out so that people can continue to use it. And also every single time that I got a new token, the old ones are invalidated, which means it would literally brick all old versions of the tool. That obviously really sucks, and I'm totally confident that there are good solutions to this issue, but they're not immediately obvious to me, and there's gonna require some more research to figure out how to implement. The second concern that I have is with the hourly data limit that I believe would likely be reached if it ended up being used by a bunch of people. If this happened, that would prevent the tool from working until that hour window had ended and the limit was reset. This would obviously be incredibly frustrating for anyone trying to use the tool, and so that's a problem. This issue could definitely be mitigated by making my code way more efficient so that it makes fewer but more targeted requests for information from Warcraft logs. But if there ends up being a lot of interest in the tool, regardless of how efficient I make it, I would likely need to look into how to raise the hourly limit that I'm allocated. Warcraft logs almost certainly has procedures for how to raise this limit, though I suspect that it could cost some money. Now, regardless of these concerns, I have come up with a number of options for giving the public access to this tool, and I'm still in the process of figuring out which of the options I think sucks the least. And so that's something that I'm likely to discuss in a future video when the tool is much closer to being ready for public consumption. Anyway, that's where I'm at with my attempt at trying to push the envelope of what our theory crafting tools are capable of. I've learned a ton throughout this process already, and there's a ton more for me to learn, so I've been having fun, and having fun is the reason why I do any of this, so I see no reason to stop now. As always, I encourage you to tell me why you think my opinions are dumb, why I'm wasting my time with this tool, how to do better, and so on and so forth. I'm also always interested in analyzing interesting topics, so if there's something that you would like me to look into, let me know in the comments. Lastly, I just want to say thank you for watching this video, and subscribe for more.